Sometimes how I think of my past is kind of like when you're walking past a wooden fence and you can kind of see like those little slivers, and you kind of walk past and you see like a little glimpse of something, but you can't see the full picture. And you walk along a bit more and you see another little glimpse of it. And that's kind of sometimes what my past felt like. I could remember some things, but there was just a lot of holes. I just believed and assumed that my life was like everybody else's. I used to get all these images in my mind. I thought that I was just making them up and that I just had this weird imagination. I also thought that I was a bit twisted as well, to kind of had these real, like these images of like children being hurt. Like it just didn't make any sense to me. But what I realised a bit later was that these were actually flashbacks. These were not just things that I'd made up in my head. The little girls that I would see in these images were actually me. It was just so painful that I think I'd separated myself from it. It was almost as if I was looking at myself as if I was another person. So I could see these images, distressing images in my mind, but as if it was happening to another person. Like it was happening to her, it wasn't happening to me. And I think that's how I survived my childhood, was by being able to separate myself from what happened so that I could go on with life. I had to come to terms with the fact that I'd been sexually abused up until the age of 12. I was born in Sydney and we spent the first 6 years of my life there, and then we moved to Queensland, and that's where I lived for the next 10 years. Being the eldest of 8 kids who are all homeschooled, I was often left with the responsibility of looking after some of the younger ones, especially when Mum got to a point where she had Ross River fever, which basically means you sleep a lot, and she had days where she couldn't get out of bed. I think being the eldest and having to take on that responsibility at a young age, it's made me grow up a lot quicker. So we did belong to like a small religious denomination. My parents taught me that we were the chosen people. They believed that only 144,000 would go to heaven and we couldn't associate with anybody outside the church. They believed that anybody in any other denomination was basically going to go to hell. All the other denominations were wrong. So anybody that didn't follow the rules, they were basically a backslider. It meant they weren't part of the church and they weren't going to go to heaven, they weren't saved. They believed that the Sabbath was on a Saturday, so from sundown on Friday to sundown on Saturday was considered Sabbath. So we had to pre-cook all our meals beforehand. We had to have our showers before the sun went down, all this kind of stuff, so that then when the Sabbath came, it was basically a rest day. So we couldn't do any work, we couldn't play. And as a kid, it was hard because you want to play and you want to explore and do all this kind of stuff, but you're not allowed. We had to call anybody that was older than us, like brother or sister. Yeah, we couldn't call them by their first names. Occasionally we'd drive down to Brisbane and go to the church there, but where we were, there wasn't anybody, so we would often have our church services with just us. We were taught that we had to respect our elders, so there was no questioning what anybody older than us said. So basically what the adults said was right. I tried as a kid to follow all the rules. I believed everything that my parents said, and especially when you don't have any other social or human interaction really to compare your upbringing with. But then as I got older, one of the questions I had was, what happens if I break one of these rules and I die before I prayed for forgiveness? They couldn't guarantee me that I would go to heaven. Like if there was something I hadn't asked for forgiveness for, then there was that no guarantee that I would be one of those 144,000 people. That kind of made me just give up in the end, because I was like, why am I doing any of this if there's not actually any guarantee that I'm going to be one of these chosen people? Just resign myself to being one of the backsliders. So growing up, we never had our birthdays celebrated. They didn't believe in celebrating birthdays or Christmases. I think because they thought that it would make us selfish and it would make us just all about the gifts and stuff. I never really knew what age I was, and it wasn't probably until my teen years that I started to really have an idea of how old I was and kind of keep track of that, because there wasn't really any reason to know how old I was. People ask me, so what age did this happen? I can't tell them because I don't know. I don't know how old I was. We were homeschooled growing up, so that meant we didn't have a lot of contact with the outside world. My parents didn't believe in associating with anybody outside of the denomination that we belonged to, and because it was quite a small denomination, the nearest church was about 4 hours away. I didn't get to see a lot of people my age. Because I didn't have that regular social contact, I wasn't developing those social skills that everyone else my age had. And so it did make it quite difficult later in life for me to actually make friends. I used to love playing doctors and nurses as a kid, and I used to love playing it with someone else too, because it made it so much more fun when it wasn't just one of my stuffed bears that I was cutting open, sewing back together again. We would occasionally have 2 or 3 man families that we had contact with for a short amount of time. There was a girl my age as well. But then one day, Mum told me that she didn't want to play with me anymore because I played too much doctors and nurses with her, so they stopped coming around. I just couldn't understand, and I thought it was my fault. But in hindsight, as an adult, it probably had more to do with disagreements between them rather than anything that I'd done, but I didn't know that as a kid. We did go to church camps sometimes, but that would be just like maybe once a year or once every 2 years. And I remember one time we went to a church camp and there were these 2 girls who were my age, and they were playing with the paper dolls. So they were like these paper dolls, and you would make paper clothing and then just like put the little clips on the back of them. And yeah, it was really nice to connect with them that way. And so I spent the next year making all these paper dolls because I was real excited and I wanted to be part of their group. And then we went to camp the next year and they didn't want to play paper dolls anymore. They'd kind of moved on. I was kind of left with my paper dolls, just feeling left out. That was hard because I'd spent that whole year in anticipation of wanting to make friends and fit in and stuff. Turns out they'd moved on. My parents taught us that we were to be in the world but not of the world. So that meant we lived in the world, but we weren't supposed to associate with anybody that was outside our religion. We had a lot of strangers coming through our house. So people would come from Korea and Asia, and they would stay at our place for a period of time in exchange for doing a bit of work around the place. It's kind of confusing that we had all these people coming in and out of the house that had nothing to do with the religion. My parents had a lot of rules that we were expected to follow, and if we didn't, we would get into trouble. Dad was the primary punisher in the house. He was usually the one who gave us the punishment. And my parents started out using wooden spoons, but when they broke them all on us, he had to go to a belt, and he also used this, it was like a thin irrigation pipe that he would cut into lengths, and he would use that to hit us. From my early years, he would take me into his room and he would like lift up my skirt and like make sure I was like bare before like flipping us over on his knee and then like hitting us. I guess he didn't want anything getting in the way of us being hurt. Then the punishment continued up until my teens. I used to be terrified of punishment because I knew how badly it hurt. And especially the thin irrigation pipe, it really hurt and would leave marks. Tell us how many that we were going to get, but if we were too slow in coming, or sometimes he would send us to go and find this irrigation pipe or a belt or whatever, so we would have to go and get it and bring it for him. And if we were too slow in finding that or couldn't find it, he would add on more. But sometimes he didn't actually even stick to those numbers. He would get real angry and just keep going and keep going and keep going. And although I've had many times where it happened to me, I think the worst part for me was hearing my siblings. Just hearing their cries, like, and knowing and that I couldn't do anything to stop it. I couldn't step in to stop it. And I think the cries of them being hit, it's just something I'll never forget. I felt so helpless, but I also knew that if I stepped in, that I'd probably get punishment too. So there was just nothing I could do. We had quite strict rules around what we could wear and what we couldn't wear. So we had to wear skirts below the knees. We couldn't wear pants or shorts because they were boys' clothing. We couldn't wear anything that was too tight fitting because otherwise it'd be revealing. We couldn't obviously wear singlets, so they had to be sleeves on our arms, and it had to be a little bit loose so that it wasn't revealing and wouldn't be too distracting for the men, I suppose. I remember one time going swimming in our dam. Normally we had to wear shorts and a t-shirt, and there was this one time where I wanted to wear a one-piece swimsuit. I was told that I had to take it off because it was too revealing and that was considered sinful, basically. Boys had to have short hair and the girls had to have the long hair. We were not allowed to wear makeup. We also couldn't dye our hair. My parents believed in alternative medicine, so any infections we had, they treated with poultices. Like they would grate up potato or onion and then stick it on the wound and then bandage it up. To stop bleeding, they'd put ground cayenne pepper all into the wound. My parents were very against doctors. I remember maybe once or twice that we actually went to a doctor. I wasn't taught a regular hygiene routine. I wasn't taught to brush my teeth every day and just take care of myself in general ways. They didn't believe in deodorant because they believed that the chemicals in it were harmful and would block your pores. They didn't believe in shaving because they believed everything should be natural. Occasionally we'd drive down to Brisbane and go to the church there. One weekend we went down there for a church service. This family, I think at the time they were living in a unit on the church site. He was in his, I would say, early teens. I was younger than him. We were playing and there was a moment where he and I were alone and he just started to take off my skirt and stuff and just touch me inappropriately, and I think I just froze in that moment. I didn't really know. I just didn't know, I guess, and so I kind of froze. And it was a while later when they actually came up to Queensland to visit us, and we were playing hide and seek in the bush and all that kind of stuff, and he decided he was going to follow me, and because it was in a gully nobody could see, and he kind of grabbed me and was wanting to touch me again and stuff, and so I tried to get up and go, and he was no, he kept pulling me down and kept touching me and being do you like this, do you like this? So I didn't tell my parents what had happened. I guess I just added it to the box of things that have happened, but they're not really worth any merit saying anything. But I did tell once in the chat rooms, I told this girl what had happened to me, and she called my parents and told my mum. And yeah, eventually that family did move up to the area that we were staying, and even though that my parents knew what had happened, they started a church group, and so every weekend I had to be in the same room as them. I really struggled with that. Just the whole thing in general was really awkward. My parents still kept taking me to church, even though I really didn't want to go to church, but they still kept taking me. I had to sit through the church services, just staring at the back of his head, and I used to just imagine just making him suffer. I know it sounds morbid, but I used to just imagine what it would be like to just hurt him. That was pretty much all I could think of when I would be just sitting in church staring at the back of his head. And yeah, and I guess in a way it felt like, again, that I hadn't been believed fully, and that maybe it wasn't something that really mattered that much at all. And again, I just couldn't make sense of it. And then later on in my teen years as well, he decided he wanted to become a minister. The leaders of the church kind of just wanted to sweep it under the rug and just kind of wanted to, I guess, not deal with it. We did end up having a meeting where one of the ministers sat down with both of us. He said he didn't address anything, he didn't acknowledge anything. He was just like, I'm sorry for anything that might have happened between us. And that was that. I guess I struggle with it because the girl he married knew what had happened, and she still married him anyway and chose to have a kid with him anyway. I just don't understand. It's one of those things again. I don't know how to reconcile it in my head. Yeah, it just felt like I wasn't believed, really. My parents initially offered counselling, but then they talked to another family and then they retracted their offer for counselling. They said that counselling only makes things worse, and I wasn't allowed to go to counselling. During my teen years, I didn't really know what was wrong with me. I just thought that there was something wrong with me. It was during my early teens that I started to experience the depression. It was like this really heavy darkness that would just come over me. Depression it's like this dark fog, this heavy blanket that just weighs you down, it steals the joy out of life, and it makes life unbearable. It makes it so unbearable. That heaviness is just so intense. It's hard to describe it to anyone who hasn't really been there. All I can say is that it gets you to the point where you can't take it anymore because it steals the hope from life. I guess I began to believe that I didn't have a future. At that point, I thought that if this was going to be the rest of my life, there's no way I can take this. I'm struggling enough to do day-to-day life, let alone do an entire lifetime of it. That's what depression feels like. I didn't know this at the time, but I also had anxiety as well, intense anxiety. I didn't know what anxiety was. Having anxiety and depression, I heard someone describe it later as having both the brake and the accelerator on at the same time. Just that both of those things inside that same body, it causes chaos. It's absolute torture. Because on one side you're feeling so heavy that that you don't want to move, but on the other hand you've got this anxiety that's kind of stirring you and driving you, and it makes you want to move and move and move. It was probably around 12 that I started to hurt myself. I don't think I knew what self-harm was at that point. I remember sitting in the bathtub and just being curled up in a ball, and I remember repeatedly hitting my head against my knee, and somehow I felt better. Self-harm is strange because you're hurting yourself, but there's also this feeling of release as well, and it's almost as if you can make the physical pain strong enough, it outweighs the pain inside for a little bit. And I think that was probably the moment that I first realised that that was going to help me. I guess I came up with a way that was going to help me get through, because I couldn't leave, I couldn't go anywhere, and somehow that pain helped me for a little bit. From there, I went to burning myself. The pain was like so intense that I felt like I was just going to pass out. It was in those moments that I felt that, I don't know, those moments of that intense pain kind of just drowned out everything else that I couldn't make sense of in my life and that was going on inside. And it just made that bearable for a while. It's like if you make something else unbearable enough, it drowns out whatever else is unbearable, even if it's only temporary. I progressed to just scratching myself and eventually cutting. There were times where I even tried to jump off things to try and break my bones, like actually break my bones. Self-harm became a regular part of my life. Eventually it did. It turned to like just sharp objects and just like cutting myself. It got worse as time went along. The thing is, as with all addictions, when you start something, it helps initially, but then you have to do more and more and more and more for it to help. And it eventually got to the point where I would cut so much that, and like lose so much blood that I would just pass out. I would get out of the bath after hurting myself and I'd find myself on the floor. And it got to the point where I did end up in hospital with blood transfusions. I really don't remember exactly how I got into online chat rooms. There was one day where I discovered what chat rooms were. I discovered that I could actually make contact with people and have some kind of social interaction with other people. My parents seemed okay with it. I eventually started spending hours each day on the chat rooms. You don't always know who's going to be on the other end. I used to get inappropriate messages from men. I kind of just went with it because people are paying me attention, like people who actually want to talk to me. One particular person that I kept in contact with, so they lived in Western Australia. One year I went over for a church camp, and then after that I was allowed to go and see this particular couple. They seemed like nice enough and stuff, and then I got there and they started to give me alcohol, and like I'd never had alcohol before that. I just knew that my parents were very anti-alcohol, so they were very like, you can't drink and all that kind of stuff. So I had my first alcoholic drink, and needless to say, like I didn't know anything about like when to stop or any of that kind of stuff. And so I did get drunk that night. They got me drunk. I was underage. Yeah, they got me drunk, and then they got me playing like a game, which then turned sexual, and then they both took advantage of me that night. They did take advantage of my naivety and my innocence and not knowing in the world. Yeah. I then flew back home. I didn't tell my parents what had happened because they were very anti-sex before marriage and anti-drinking, so why was I going to tell them? I'd get into lots of trouble with them. It's hard to reconcile the standard that my parents set. You can't meet anybody outside of the denomination, but then on the other hand, they're like letting me meet strangers off the internet. It just doesn't make sense in my head, and I can't reconcile it. I just don't understand, and maybe I never will. One of my grandparents called Child Protective Services or something on us, and we had 2 undercover detectives rock up at our doorstep. And I remember just being so terrified at that point that I was going to get taken away. Or the thing is, when you've grown up in that environment and you've been taught that this is like you're the chosen people, everybody outside of this is worldly and they're going to go to hell and all that kind of stuff, you're terrified that being outside of it, it means you're going to suffer these eternal consequences. I guess I grew up under the assumption that outside people would always make it worse. So I didn't actually know that the police could help me. At 14, I decided I was going to run away from home. I did not want to be at home at this point. It just felt like this never-ending expanse of time. I remember counting down the years that I had left until I was legally able to leave home. But I think it got just to a point where one day I was like, I just can't take this anymore. I'm going to run away from home. So I planned it out. I secretly bought this box of hair dye because we weren't allowed to dye our hair, but I wanted to make sure that nobody found me. Just make myself unrecognisable. I packed a backpack with like food supplies. I really thought about all of it. And so the night before, I dyed my hair secretly and then put a bandana on my head. And Mum asked me, she's like, why are you wearing that? And I was like, just because I want to. She didn't question it any further. Mum went off and did her shopping and then I just disappeared. I didn't tell her anything. I just got my backpack and I walked off. I booked a bus from Bundaberg all the way down to Sydney and I got on and just left. I was going to go to Sydney and I'd planned out that I was going to go and work as a prostitute. It's in the looking back when I realise the full extent of what happened in my childhood that I can understand why I would think it would be okay at 14 to go and work as a prostitute. It made a lot of sense. I got to Sydney and I contacted a friend who I'd made online. She called the police and the police sent me back to Bundaberg. I was just angry at that point. I didn't want to be there. I was angry that I'd been sent back and that my plan hadn't worked. So from that point forward, all I could think about was leaving home. And eventually my parents said, look, you can start going to school and we'll board you with this family we know. And that's how I first left home. The family I was boarding with, the parents, he beat her up so badly that she was put into hospital, and so the next morning we had to move out. I remember just getting all our stuff and we ended up living in this old bus where the seats had all been taken out and converted into bunk beds, and so we all lived in this converted bus for a while. From there, I think I kind of just place hopped for a bit. I started going to school at age 16. I started going and boarding with this family who had a few kids my age, and I started attending this private Christian school. This was the first time I'd ever attended school in my life. It was a completely foreign environment. Not only was the learning style completely different, like I'd never done assessments or anything like that, the whole social scene was just, I felt like a fish out of water. I had no idea what I was doing. I didn't know how to be social. I didn't know how to hold a conversation with someone. I didn't know how to make friends and hold a friendship. It was very overwhelming going from a sheltered environment to where you basically see your siblings all day to going to a school. Like, it wasn't a massive school by any standards. But for me, that was like, there was a lot of humans around. And I think also starting halfway through grade 10, everybody had already knew each other. They'd already made their friends. I was very much a quiet kid. And also there was not a lot that I felt like I could relate to. Like they'd had the years of making friends, they'd watched movies. There was a lot of common ground that they held with each other. But for me, I had very little common ground with these people. I had to start learning at age 16 what they'd spent a whole lifetime learning. I didn't really do well at school, so I began failing assessments. Like, I didn't put in assessments because I didn't know how to do them. I would then have to be sat on suspension just to do the assessment. In maths class, I just began doing Sudoku instead of listening in class because it just kind of all went over my head, and I'd just kind of given up at that point. And I think the teacher kind of gave up on me as well because I just knew he got real frustrated that I was just doing this and not paying any attention. But I don't think he knew that I just was so out of my depth and didn't know what I was doing. And I ended up leaving halfway through grade 12 to start a job. I think some of the teachers noticed that I was really struggling. They must have known that something was wrong, and at one point they called in a counsellor. She was one of the kindest people I'd probably met up until that point. I don't know that if she knew really what to do with me or how to help me, and I struggled to help her understand what was going on with me because I really didn't know what was going on either. She's one of those people who genuinely cares. Like they don't do it just because it's a job. They actually care that you're hurting. And I remember she used to sit with me many times and I didn't know what to talk about. I just knew that I was really struggling. She was the one who would call the ambulance when I told her that I'd overdosed. I remember one time, it was a bad overdose. I'd taken a significant amount of pills and ended up in hospital. And she was the one person who came and sat with me in the emergency room, and she held my hands as they had to try and get an artery, which was really painful. But she sat there with me through the whole of the emergency room when she didn't have to, it was outside school hours. She cared about me in the best way that she knew how to, and that has stuck with me. The small kindnesses or the not so small kindnesses of people who actually genuinely care and they don't want anything from you. I remember the first time that I overdosed. It was a small amount of pills. I didn't know at the time it was not going to do anything to me, but I took them, and the moment I took them, I was like, oh no, I don't know if I'm ready to die. And I remember just being like, God, please just save me. Please, if you're there, can you please just not let me die? And I didn't tell my parents or anything, and nothing really happened. But then not long later, I found myself back in the same place. This time I took more. Again, I never told them and they never noticed. But as time went on, the overdosing got worse and worse, because every time the darkness would kind of get worse and worse, and that hopelessness and despair. But I was also trapped in my head, I couldn't talk to anyone about what was going on. I didn't know what to do with what was going on inside, so it would just get to the point where it become unbearable, and I thought that the only way to fix things was to end it. It's not that I wanted to die, it's just that I wanted the pain to stop. Although I hadn't told my parents about the overdosing initially, they did eventually find out because I started to end up in hospital. There was one time where I'd overdosed the night before and I was feeling quite sick, and I had to go to school the next day. I got to school and told the school counsellor, and needless to say, I ended up in hospital. When Dad found out what had happened, he got really angry. He got really angry at me that I'd put all their lives in danger, and that I'd driven with others in the car and could have potentially killed everyone. And he got real angry at me about that and said that I was very selfish, and didn't say a single thing about me being in the hospital bed, having tried to end my own life. He was more worried about everybody else's lives and not mine. I kept ending up in hospital. Each overdose got worse and worse. I ended up in intensive care. There was one time where I ended up in hospital, and the nurse that I had, she told me that I was selfish and that I was taking up a bed that could have been better used for someone else. There was nothing I could say to her. My parents had also taught me growing up that those who committed suicide would go straight to hell because it was a sin. In a way, I felt really trapped because there just didn't seem to be any way out. I think part of me had given up trying to follow all the rules anyway, so I kind of had deemed myself a sinner, and I was backslidden. I couldn't actually be part of that chosen people. I don't think it mattered whether I died or not, because either way, I felt like I was going to go to hell. I became obsessed with death early in my teenage years. I began to wear dark clothing, and black became my new favourite colour. I dyed my hair black, my whole entire wardrobe was black. I wore black makeup. It very much reflected the inner state that I was feeling. And the heaviness of it just got so intense that death was the only option for me to make that pain inside and that heaviness inside of me end. I really did want to die because my life had become so unbearable. But there was a part of me that desperately didn't want to be another statistic. I knew that if I died, nobody would know that I even existed, let alone died. And that really bothered me. So after I'd overdosed one time, I completely just shut down. I didn't want to see my parents. I refused to let them see me in hospital. And I refused to talk to the doctors, and I basically was mute. They called a conference, and so they decided that the best thing to do was to send me to Brisbane to a adolescent and kids psych ward. And so I spent 2 weeks on a psych ward. Before being sent to Brisbane, I was also refusing to eat. I didn't know what an eating disorder was at that point. But when I got to Brisbane, one of the nurses said to me, "You actually need to eat, otherwise we're going to have to keep you here longer and make you eat." And so at that point I was like, well, okay, fine, I'll just eat. There was another girl on the unit who had severe anorexia, and I'd never encountered that before. Like, it was very foreign to me. That was how I discovered what an eating disorder was. There began my descent into eating disorder. I think my eating has always been disordered, not by my choice, but just because of how I was raised. My parents had very strict rules around what we could and couldn't eat and what times we could and couldn't eat. We're allowed 2 meals a day, breakfast and lunch. They had to be a minimum of 6 hours apart, so we didn't eat evening meals when I was growing up. We couldn't drink any liquids with our meals. We were raised strict vegans, so there was no refined food, so no white flour, no white pasta, nothing like that. We also didn't have snacks. We actually got in trouble if we were caught snacking. I remember one time I was supposed to be feeding my younger sister a banana, and I was hungry and I ate some of the banana, but then Dad came along and he was like, "Have you been eating the banana?" And I was like, "No," because I didn't want to get into trouble. And he's like, "Have you been eating the banana?" He's like, "You can't lie to me." And I was like, "No." Yeah, he was like, "I need to smell your breath." And so he did. And he's like, "You've been eating the banana." And I got into trouble for eating that banana. Once I left home, I started trying different foods and new foods and stuff like that. And I started eating 3 meals a day. But it wasn't long before my issues with food kind of caught up with me again. So I began to restrict my foods. I became very obsessed with needing to know what calories were in every single thing. I would read the back of food packets like it was my favourite pastime. Like, I would go to the supermarkets and I would spend hours just going up and down the aisles just trying to find like the lowest calorie foods and the lowest fat foods. When you starve yourself, suddenly all you can think about is food. Like, it becomes the number one thing that's on your mind. Like, you cannot think about anything else. It becomes about thinking about, what am I going to eat next? What am I not going to eat next? What am I allowed to eat? I would keep a diary of everything I'd eaten. I had like a little calorie counter book. This was before apps were here. It just became this whole obsession about numbers and sticking below a certain amount of numbers. And the thing is, you set a certain number to go below, but then when you get there, you set a new low and a new low. I also had that same obsession with my weight as well. So I would obsessively weigh myself every single day, sometimes multiple times a day. All you can see is how much you've got to lose. And you could be a stick and all you see is fat. The problem was, I actually did enjoy food. So after a period of not eating, I would get so hungry that I would just eat anything and everything that I could get my hands onto. And then I'd feel so immensely guilty about it. Like, I'd feel so horrible and disgusting. And that's when the bulimia started. I discovered this way, well, so I thought that I could lose weight but also eat. Bulimia it's a horrible cycle. It's just an absolutely vicious cycle. I would often not eat throughout the whole day, but then the evening would come and I'd be so hungry that I would just eat whatever I could get my hands on. Sometimes I would just ride my bike to the nearest grocery store and get whatever was on sale that I knew would be easy to throw up, and I would just eat it all. And then I'd spend the rest of the time in the bathroom, and then I'd be still so hungry, so I'd go eat more and I'd throw up again. And it's just this horrible cycle that you're always so hungry, but then when you eat, you feel so terrible about yourself, like you feel so disgusting and fat. Just like an absolute failure that you didn't have that self-control to say no to food. Every day became thinking about what I was going to eat next, or how I was going to get rid of it, or all of these kinds of things. And there was not a single moment where I could just think about other stuff. Like, my head just becomes so full and so consumed with anything food related that there's no space in your head for anything else. What at first had become a coping mechanism for me very soon controlled my life, and there was no way I could get out of it. It just became more and more intense, and I spent more and more time binging and purging. And after like a binge and purge cycle, like, you're so exhausted that you can't actually do anything anyway. And your body is so deprived that you just feel exhausted and tired all the time. At night times after work, I would just walk the streets. I would just walk and walk and walk and walk. I just wanted to, I wanted to do it to lose weight, but B, I didn't know at the time, but I had anxiety as well, and I felt that like the anxiety, like just the walking helped as well. And the problem also is when you starve yourself, you can't sleep at night. It's just horrible. Like, you're so tired all the time, but you get insomnia and you can't sleep. Not being able to rest, but really desperately needing to rest. It was just this whole unhealthy obsession with being thin. I would not wish having an eating disorder on my worst enemy. It's such a vicious cycle, and the turmoil and the chaos inside is just so all-consuming. And the inability to be able to stop it by yourself, it left me feeling so trapped and so alone and so hopeless. No matter how much I tried to stop, I couldn't stop. I knew that I couldn't keep going on like that. I think around 16, I got a boyfriend. I didn't really know how to do relationships, so it really only did last a few months. And I think, honestly, in the looking back, I think I just went out with him because I wanted, it was a way to get out of the house. He had a car, but he was looking for something a bit more serious, and I couldn't give that to him. While I was with him, there was one day, for some reason, he wasn't able to bring me home that night, so he said to me, "I'll give you some money to take a taxi home." I'd been taught by my parents that you can't take gifts from strangers or even people you know. Like, you can't receive anything because then you'll be indebted to them, and you can't be indebted to people. So I had this voice in the back of my head going, you can't accept anything from anyone. I ended up sleeping with the taxi driver to pay for my way back home so that I didn't have to be indebted to my boyfriend with this money. It was the first time that I used my body in exchange for something. When I lived in town, I used to do a lot of walking of the streets. So one night I was walking around the streets as I did. This blue car pulled up, and this guy introduced himself as Jay, which I found out later was not his real name. He asked me to get in the car with him, so I was like, okay, why not? And yeah, he ended up sleeping with me that night. But it wasn't just a one-night encounter. He ended up becoming my pimp. I was underage at that time. I had a few people question whether I was the age that I was saying I was. And even though some of them questioned it, they still slept with me anyway, even though I think they knew that I was underage. I felt like I was worth nothing anyway, and I felt like my whole life people had used me for free anyway. So I was like, if people are offering me money, at least I'm getting something out of this. Like, at least there's some kind of value that they're giving me. Like, although I knew that, like, people look down on prostitutes and all that kind of stuff, and I knew that they, like, some people thought of them as lowest of the low. I honestly just felt that I was like one of the lowest of the lows, so it didn't seem wrong to me. Like, it just seemed like I'd found something where I could actually use my body for something of worth, even if that was only money. Things just started to get darker and darker around what he was suggesting and wanting me to do, and it was starting to scare me. I think the darkest point for me was one night Jay took me to a park. He said something to me about how this particular area had spirits and stuff, and that if I brought a razor blade along and cut myself there, that it would appease these spirits or whatever. But when I got there, like, I had the razor blades on me, but suddenly I was like really terrified because it was dark, like it was the middle of a park where there was no one else around, no light. It started to make references to satanic kind of rituals and stuff, to ask me if I would actually consider killing someone. And I was obviously very hesitant about this all, because I'm like, what the hell have I just gotten myself into? So I was actually terrified at that point, because I was like, if this guy is into this kind of stuff, he's clearly capable of harming me. And that's what I feared for at that point, was for my life, because he'd also made references to having a gun. And I started getting really scared, because I was like, he could actually legit kill me and leave me here. Like, there's no one around to hear me. There's no one around to see anything or help me. Like, he started pushing me to give him the razor blades so that we could do this ceremony of sorts. And I kept refusing. And eventually he got really angry with me. And he's like, okay, we actually really need to appease these spirits because they're really angry now. And he took me back to his car, and I kind of just tried to get away at that point, but he got really angry and he ended up just grabbing me and raping me. And I didn't fight him because I was just terrified for my life at that point. I remember walking away through that park and just sitting in a gutter on the side of the road. And I called someone who'd been really nice to me and stuff. And I called her and I was like, this is what's just happened. I've just been raped. And she's like, I can't come. I'm at a family barbecue and I just can't come. And so in the moment that I actually just most needed someone, there was just no one. There was no one. What shook me later, quite a few years later, was finding out that he was actually part of a church. And I think that really it really just shook me, realising that yet another person from the church who claimed to be a Christian was on the flip side actually doing just horrendous things. And he was not the only one. And I think that just further shattered my view on Christianity, and it just left me really disillusioned. Once I'd left school, I was put into a Centrelink job placement program, and the guy who was my case manager happened to be a Christian. I didn't have any trust of any guys at this point. I just kind of half expected them all to basically just use me for whatever, but he was probably the first genuine guy that I ever met that didn't want anything from me and who kind of just met me where I was at and tried to help me as best as he could. So he went to a conference at Hervey Bay where he heard Janine and Lewis speak. Janine and Lewis were running a program called Destiny Haven, and he'd heard them speak about it and share their testimony and story, and he'd apparently spoken to them about me. And so 2 weeks later, I was at Destiny Haven. I came to Destiny Haven in 2009. I was still 18 at the time. I remember walking through those doors and just feeling so lost and confused. I wasn't quite sure what I'd gotten myself into. I knew that it was a long-term residential program for women, and that meant usually a minimum of 12 months. When I first got to Destiny, I knew straight away that it was different. I'd been in hospitals before and they're very cold and clinical, and the staff are paid to be there. But when I came to Destiny and I learnt that none of the staff were paid and that they were here because they actually wanted to be, that made a difference to me. Like, that actually meant something to me, because that helped me realise that they actually just wanted to see broken people like myself just be free. I realised that it was more of a family environment. You could tell they'd cared and loved each girl here. I remember meeting Janine and hearing her story for the first time. What really resonated with me was hearing her own journey of healing and how she'd also come from addiction, and although that looked quite different to what my history had, it just gave me real tangible hope that things could be different. The fact that she'd been there and done that, it meant a lot more to me than someone who has never been there and done that, and her words held that more of that power and authentic realness to it. So the staff at Destiny made an extra effort to celebrate each girl's birthday, and I'd never had the birthday celebrated before, so coming here and having my birthday celebrated was a whole new experience. It was such a foreign and new experience for me, but at the same time I felt really special inside as well, because there were people who wanted to celebrate my birthday with me. When you come to Destiny, it is a place to stop running from the demons that you've spent your whole entire life running from. It's where you can't hide behind any of the addictions anymore. And that can be actually really terrifying, to have to face the things that you've spent so much energy and so much time pushing down. And that can be really messy and really painful. I spent so much of my life trying to just numb everything that was going on inside. And what I didn't realise until I got to Destiny Haven was that when you numb those emotions, you also numb the good emotions. Like, you can't selectively numb those emotions. I realised that if I wanted to feel these positive emotions and stuff, that like the happiness and the joy that I wanted to, I was going to have to feel like the sadness and the anger and the hurt. And that was a terrifying prospect. Part of the process was learning what those emotions were and then learning how to identify them in myself. And once I could learn what those emotions were that I was feeling, I was then able to hear what that emotion was trying to tell me. At Destiny, we started this group called Anger Management, and I was like, why on earth am I doing an anger management group? I don't get angry. As I did the group, I realised that I actually do get angry. It's just that I'm not an outwardly, expressively angry person. I'm someone who turns anger in on myself. And I think I learnt that growing up. So we'd be punished if we got angry. We're taught not to let the sun go down on our anger, and all these Bible verses about not being angry. So I'd learnt from a very young age that it wasn't acceptable for me to be angry, but it was acceptable for the adults around me to be angry. I remember many counselling sessions that I had in the beginning. They were very challenging because I didn't know what to say. I knew there was something wrong, I just didn't know what it was, and I didn't know how to put it into words. So many of those initial counselling sessions I spent sitting in silence because I had no idea what to say. It was really hard for me to actually make progress initially because there was such a wall. I found that when I'd be sitting in counselling, I'd get so anxious that I'd just freeze and I'd shut down and my mind would just go completely blank and I was not able to actually talk about or process anything. So writing for me was one of the biggest breakthroughs, and I think that helps my counsellor be able to see beyond just that initial frozenness that I was feeling. I was actually able to let the words flow and just let everything in my head just kind of come out on paper. That's very much how she began to be able to help me. And I found that way that I was actually able to start to express myself. When I first got to Destiny Haven, I said to my counsellor, I was like, nothing really happened to me. My upbringing was pretty normal. And as time went on, I realised just how not normal my upbringing was. And the more work that I did, the more I realised just how messy it was. I'd blocked out whole sections of my childhood. It's kind of like Swiss cheese, but with more holes than cheese. We also did a lot of art therapy at Destiny, and it was in the art therapy that some of the sexual abuse started to make itself known. I used to get all these images in my mind, but I thought that I was just making them up and that I just had this weird imagination. I also thought that I was a bit twisted as well to kind of had these real, like these images of like children being hurt. Like it just didn't make any sense to me. But what I realised a bit later was that these were actually flashbacks. These were not just things that I'd made up in my head. Because how would I know to make these up in my head? The little girls that I would see in these images were actually me. And that was really hard to come to terms with. After a while of processing what I came to realise were flashbacks, I had to come to terms with the fact that I'd been sexually abused up until the age of 12. I think it was a bit of a double-edged sword, realising what I'd actually been through. It gave validity to all the struggles I'd had, like the intensity of the eating disorder and the self-harm and how strong the anxiety and the depression was. There was a very strong part of me that wanted to deny the reality of what had happened, and that part of me kept going, no, you've made it up, like you're imagining it all, like none of this is real, like you're just messed up. The denial for me was a big protective factor. It helped keep me sane for so many years. If I believed it wasn't real, then it wasn't happening. And that way I could believe that I was living in a normal family and that it was all okay. But then another part of me would be like, no, but when you look at all the side effects of trauma, they're all throughout my life. How can you actually be making that up? You can't. And it took a long time to reconcile those two things. And it has been a long journey of working through that. And I think I'll live with some of the effects of that for the rest of my life, but I think that I can learn to live a more fuller life where the effects of that slowly lessen. I'd come from a Christian background, and I guess I'd not had a real great experience with that. So I was a little bit dubious about coming to a Christian program. When I came to Destiny, I realised it was quite a different experience to what I'd had growing up. Because of what my parents taught me about God and how I was raised, it left me with a skewed version of who I thought God was. I had to unlearn everything that I'd learned, and it's still an ongoing process for me. The God that I was taught about here was more about relationships and the unconditional love of not only just him, but of each other as well. And I think what also helped was the fact that I saw what they were teaching in the lives of the staff as well. I knew that they genuinely cared about us, and I didn't have to be perfect to get that. Even if they had a moment, like, they were still able to come back and say, I'm sorry. There are still some aspects of Christianity that I do struggle with, and I'm aware that it's one of the consequences of trauma. I think I do struggle sometimes with connecting with God in traditional ways that other people may. So I think for me, writing was a way that it hadn't been tainted, I suppose, by that trauma. So I was able to enter into that world through the doorway of writing in a way that I hadn't ever before. Despite my experiences, I do believe in a God. I think if people ask me how I viewed God, I could easily say all the Christianese things. If I were to strip all that away, I can see how this redemptive thread has been woven through my story. And I do truly believe that if it hadn't have been for someone bigger than myself who had a plan and a purpose for my life, I would not be here today. There were many times where I wanted to end it all, and it never quite worked. So I know for certain in my heart that there is someone bigger than myself looking out for me. Change is possible, and there is that redemptive thread that's woven through my life, and it's woven through everybody's life if they would just notice it. I remember another girl who went through the program the same time as me, and I remember seeing her graduate, and I still hadn't finished the program. Turns out comparison is the worst thing anybody can do, because you'll always feel bad about yourself. I felt like I was very stuck, especially because it took me so long to work through things. What Janine had to keep reminding me was that my story was different to hers. Because of what I'd been through, it was going to take me a bit longer to actually work through it. And I don't think I understood that I'd missed out on so many fundamental things growing up. I kind of had to catch up on those and learn those things that the other girls may not necessarily have had to learn. I think I had to live some life here to understand what healthy looked like. And it was as I began to understand what healthy looked like, I was able to see in my past what wasn't healthy. I think out of everyone who's been through the program, it's taken me the longest. I was there for almost 2 years, it probably was 2 years actually. Although I was really frustrated at the time about how long this journey was taking me, I am grateful in the looking back because I can see that I very much did need that extra time and that extra support. There's been a lot of helpful tools that I've learnt in my recovery journey, and you know what? I think different tools have played a more important role at different points in my life. I think hope makes such a difference, because if you don't have hope, then why are you trying any of the other things? And like, hope is one of those things that I didn't have for many, many years. When you lose hope, nothing matters, and you have to have that sense of hope, like even if it's the smallest glimmer that someone else shines for you, until you can grab hold of it for yourself, because that will get you through learning all the other things, and it'll help you walk through those places that you want to avoid, that are going to get you to the point of healing. I realised at Destiny Haven that I was actually creative. It was not something I'd ever even considered about myself. Part of the program is that you can learn different skills, and one of them was sewing. I'd not really had any sewing experience. So one of the team here taught me how to sew. We would make up these reusable bags to then sell in our social enterprise. I initially was not very great at it. Sewing a straight line was a challenge for me. And there were many times where I just wanted to quit and give it up. Over that 2-year period where I was in program, I did a lot of sewing, let me tell you. And the more I did it, the more I began to enjoy it. Towards the end of program, we did this group where we were asked a question of, if you could be anything in the world, regardless of time or money or age or education, like if all that was not an issue, what would you do? And that stuck with me so much. Like that group had such an impact on my life, and it taught me how to just dream big and dream wild and crazy, like with no limitations. It was around that time that I also started experimenting with sewing clothing. I really didn't know what I was doing, and it was pretty evident in some of my designs. I couldn't quite make them all fit together. I decided that I wanted to start a pyjama line for Destiny, and I got all this fabric and I cut out all these patterns. I was going to do like 10 pairs of pyjamas, and when you have 10 pairs, you're supposed to cut out 10 fronts and 10 backs. I cut out 20 backs. It was at that point I realised I should probably actually go and study fashion. Like, I really don't know what I'm doing, clearly. I need to learn some more. And so I applied to a local TAFE, and they had 3 spots remaining, and they had 20 people applying. I got one of those spots, and for the next 2 years I studied fashion design and technology. That course taught me everything that I'd hoped to learn. So it taught me all the basics of pattern making, of cutting out things, of construction, and I really enjoyed the practical side of it. I'm not going to lie, towards the end I did want to quit, and I actually marched into my teacher's office and I was like, I'm done, I can't do this anymore, this is just too hard. Thankfully they convinced me to stay to finish. As I continued to study, I'd take the skills that I was learning and then I'd start to create outfits in my spare time. The more I sewed, the more I realised I liked creating evening wear and gowns. And I especially loved the high-end couture, like all the details and all the sparkles and the lace, and everything about it just made me very happy. And I was like, that's what I want to do. I really like the whimsical and the beautiful and the kind of that otherworldly feel, and I think that is very evident in the gowns that I make. I think part of it probably has to do with the fact that I was never allowed to read fairy tales and whatnot growing up. So as an adult at Destiny Haven, I was given one of the Grimm's fairy tales books to read, and so I read through that, and I really enjoyed the stories and whatnot in it. So I think as an adult, I started to access that part of me that really enjoyed this whimsical fairy tale-like stories and gowns and whatnot. Being able to access that then meant that I could create this world in my head that I could then bring to life through my gowns. I really enjoy creating. I love the process of being able to take bits of fabric and then make them into a beautiful gown. I soon realised that there's a whole world out there where creatives will collaborate with each other for work for their portfolios. And so I started doing collaborative shoots with local photographers and models and makeup artists, and people really started to like my work and started to follow me. It was through social media mostly that I started to get myself out there, and I continued to do more and more collaborations and more photo shoots, and I really enjoyed it. I really just loved it. I started to get some magazine publications. One of the highlights for me was going to Canberra and collaborating with a photographer whose work I like down there, and some of those photos ended up on Vogue Italia's website. That was one of those really happy moments for me, because I was like, woohoo, I've got some work in Vogue, like, woohoo, like this is real exciting. I finished studying fashion in 2014, and from there I kept working different jobs. I worked in alterations, I worked various hospitality jobs, all the while just still creating and doing photo shoots and whatnot. One of my goals was to really learn more about the high-end couture side of things. There's not a lot of that in Australia, so I was like, okay, the foundations of bridal are very similar. So I got a job in Sydney part-time working in a couture handmaids custom bridal place, and I am so grateful that she gave me that chance to work there and to learn. I know that a lot of designers probably would not give another designer a chance to learn and to work for them whilst still doing their own stuff, but she did, and for that, like, I was very grateful for. Over the years, I have done a fair few fashion shows. I did my first one through Raw Artists. I did like the most crazy creative collection, and I really enjoyed it, and it was just heaps of fun. It was very out there and very different to everyone else's, but I loved it. So I flew down to Melbourne and I participated in a competition down there, and I received an award. That was very special for me because it was like the first time I'd received an award for fashion. So I continued to apply for different fashion competitions, and then I came across a grant, like Lane Beachley's Aim for the Stars Foundation was giving grants to young women who had big dreams, and she wanted to help them along the way. And so I put in my application, not really expecting to hear back, because a lot of them I don't. So I put it in, forgot about it, until I got a call from Lane Beachley, and she told me that I was successful. I received that scholarship, and I got to go to the gala dinner, and I got to meet a lot of amazing women along the way. And that was really encouraging that someone like Lane Beachley saw my heart behind what I wanted to do, and she believed in me. I also got to design a dress for Lane Beachley, which was very exciting because she was one of the first well-known people that I got to dress, and it made me very proud when she was wearing my dress. So I spoke at a couple of different events. At this point, I was also wanting to do a collection. When I went to one of these speaking events, it was these fancy people were there, like Julia Gillard speaking and whatnot, and I'd gotten to go along and share my story. But after I'd spoken, they got up and announced that they'd given me another grant to study, to actually do this collection, which was really amazing because I was not expecting it, and that's probably the first time in my life that I cried happy tears. It just completely took me by surprise. that they wanted to invest in me yet again. After I'd spoken at this women's event, I get an email from this company called Lenovo, and they're asking me if I would like to be one of their ambassadors. Now, again, me, who has no idea who anyone is, I went to Google, typed in Lenovo, and I was like, whoa, they're a big computer company. And so I said yes. And so I got to be a brand ambassador for Lenovo, where I would design some dresses and we would film this campaign, which was really exciting too. I chose to work with a young girl called Stephanie Curlow. She was the first world's hijab ballerina, and she'd also received a Lane Beachley scholarship as well. I thought she was really inspirational, and I was like, one day I want to work with this girl. And so I did. I actually got to do a campaign with her and design her a custom outfit, and just seeing her dance with my outfit on, it was such a beautiful moment, just seeing her dance in this room. Everybody on that film team was moved to tears because it was just such a beautiful and touching moment. And eventually one day I was like, okay, I'm just going to make the jump to Sydney. This is where everything is happening, and it's probably good for my designs because I'm close to everyone. I could very quickly realise that living in a big city was not what I imagined it to be. It just became this whole cycle of working and paying the bills and working, and I ended up having to get a second job just to be able to afford to live down there. And I found that I was having less and less time to work on my own designs. I also didn't know anybody in Sydney, so I didn't have a support network down there. I'd planned on making that support network, but I found that by the end of the day I was just so tired that I just wanted to go home and just do nothing. I felt like I had nothing left in me to give. It eventually all caught up with me, and I found myself at a point where all I was doing was existing. It was exhausting. And I found myself in a dark space very quickly. I had this idea in my head that I would be making it big and that I would be doing all these amazing things, and I'd be living this life that I should be living, this success story. But it hadn't quite turned out how I expected. And I don't think I really wanted to admit to anyone that I was struggling to the depth that I was. There was this lady who came across what I was doing, and she was a teacher of this business course, and she really believed in me and believed in what I was doing. She sponsored me to do this business course. As I was doing that, she was like, what do you want to do? And I was like, I want to release a collection. I want to do a runway and release a collection and whatnot. And she's like, okay, let's make this happen. We held this fundraising event where I did a runway show and a talk, and we did this whole dinner, and I raised the funds to be able to show at a runway show up in Brisbane and to be able to do my collection. It was not long after that, maybe 4 or 6 weeks after that, that I was supposed to be showing up in Brisbane. I hadn't started this collection at all. I was still working full-time down in Sydney. Amongst this, I decided I'd had enough of Sydney, so I moved back to Newcastle. So I was trying to find a place to live. I was moving, I was trying to prepare for this runway show. It was this new job. It was just all happening at once. And it was the most stressful time of my entire life. I have never experienced that much anxiety ever. I did not love the pieces that I produced. There was nothing wrong with them, but I knew that I didn't love the pieces that I produced. And I think also the stress of that short time frame, combined with everything else that was happening around me, was just all too much for me, and it stole the joy out of any creating that I was doing, and it wasn't fun anymore. I did end up flying to Brisbane and showing my collection up there. I knew that I wasn't entirely happy with it, even though this was a milestone that I'd wanted to achieve for such a long time. I started my new job at the disability mental health place. From someone on the outside looking in, they would think that I had like the perfect life. Like I had my garage space for designing, like I was working in a well-paid job, like I was earning more than any other job I'd worked at, and I was living in like this really nice little house as well. What was going on for me was not what it looked like from the outside. So this was the first time I'd ever done shift work. I realised in that job shift work is not for me. I couldn't maintain a healthy eating routine. I couldn't, like everything just became so thrown like completely off balance. I found myself back in that binging, purging routine. I was self-harming again. I knew that I was not okay, but I still didn't want to tell anyone how bad it was. I felt so much guilt that I was struggling so badly. I think it was believing that I should have been this success story and that I should have been like this person that I thought I was supposed to be. It was what prevented me from getting help and support earlier, and unfortunately I thought everybody was going to be disappointed in me because I was struggling. And I thought that I was a bit of a failure because I was struggling. There was one day where I'd been starving myself, and I realised how close to the edge I was feeling, and nobody knew. My anxiety was again so bad that like I'd scratched the skin off my hands. Like I'd been actively thinking about suicide. Like it had just gotten so dark in my head that I didn't care about anything. And it was about that time that I ended up talking to Janine. I just ended up telling her how bad it was, and I was just like, I'm really not okay. And she's like, well, if you want, you can come back and have some support again. Initially I said no. I was like, no, because that means I'm failing or whatnot. I ended up saying yes because I knew that if I kept going the way I was going, it was not going to end well. And unfortunately, a few days later, I was working an evening shift. I just thought to myself, I cannot do another single day of work. I did plan my suicide, and I wrote my note, and after work, I drove into Newcastle, and I sat on the beach. I sat watching the waves, and there was nobody around, everything was empty. And I had enough pills to guarantee that I would not survive. And I'd popped them all out and everything, and it was literally the only thing for me to do was to take them. I don't know why I didn't take them that night, because everything in me had planned to. But somehow midnight in that night, it was like this calmness just kind of came over me. And it was a calmness that was just outside of myself. And everything felt like real crystal clear and still. And it was in that moment that I was like, okay, I'm just going to go home and go to bed. The next morning I told my therapist, and needless to say, I left my job that day and I came back to Destiny. It was such a close call because I had every intent of not coming home that night. So I definitely know that I'm alive for a reason. In those first few months of being at Destiny, it was every single day felt like just absolute torture. Like, it was just such a dark place inside my head. I was in the office every evening, like, just crying my eyes out, just being like, begging Janine just to let me die. Like, I just did not, like, I couldn't take this darkness inside my head anymore. Like, and she's like, no, I'm not letting you. Like, I'm not letting you. And somehow we got through those next few months, and slowly, just very, very slowly, I started to have good days again, and with a lot of support from like the staff and being on medication and whatnot. For many months after, like, I couldn't stand to even think about designing. I don't know, I just got to a point where I didn't care about anything, and even the thought of designing, for the first time in my life, I found the idea of it kind of repulsive, and I'd never experienced that before. For that first year and a bit, I pretty much I didn't do designing, I didn't do anything really creative, I just did life. And it was kind of through gardening that I started to find that little bit of spark again, that little bit of joy, that little bit of something that kind of interested me. Like, when I got to that really dark spot and I took that break from designing, I slowly became interested in starting to sew again. And so I would start to just sew little bits and pieces and I started to make gowns again. And I took on very selective projects that I knew were going to actually spark something in me. I stayed at Destiny Haven for 2 years this time. So I wasn't full on in program, I was here, I was being supported, but I was also participating in all the events and whatnot. And yeah, slowly, just that hope started to come back again. But it was a long journey out of that dark space this time. I do wish that I'd been able to admit that I was struggling a lot earlier, because I probably wouldn't have gotten to that dark space. Because there were many times along the way that I'd gotten to the point where I was suicidal. But then I'd move and get a new job and it'd be okay for a while. And then I'd end up back in that dark place where I'd be suicidal again, and then it was this whole pattern that I realised was happening. My story is what it is. I did eventually get that support that I needed, and this time I'm doing it a lot slower. I'm making sure that I do things differently this time, and that I put the supports in that I do need, because I don't want to go back to that place again. I know I can't do it again. I thought that finishing the program at Destiny Haven would meant that I was fixed, tick, that I was healed, tick, and that everything would be fine. I thought that finishing the program meant that I would not have any more struggles or anything like that. That is not true. Healing is very much a journey, and there are different layers. I think what Destiny Haven does is gives you the tools to prepare you for the life outside. Learning to use those tools and learning to put into place all those things you've learnt, it's like a whole nother layer of the journey. One of the main reasons I think I ended up back in those dark spaces was because I didn't ask for help sooner. I thought that I should have it all together and that I should be able to do it all alone, and it turns out you can't do anything alone. Like, to do life you need to have relationships, healthy relationships, and it doesn't matter what stage of the journey you're at, you're always going to have something that comes up that's challenging, or that you're going to need to work on. Doesn't mean you'll be working on the same thing for your entire life. It just means you might be working on different aspects that come up. Yeah, I do think healing is a journey, and what I've learned is that I will always be learning, and there'll be never a point where I will have it all together. There'll never be a point where I'm this person that I think I should be. And if I start to believe that, that is very quickly going to entrap me back in that same space of not being able to ask for help. I'll always need to ask for help at some point. I'll always need support at some point, just like every other human in this world. I'm not Superwoman and I can't do it all on my own. It's about learning what my limits are, what's going to be helpful for me on my own journey. And it's okay to have people there to help you get back up when you stumble, because inevitably you will stumble at some point, and everybody does. I stumbled many times, and the problem was I didn't let people help me back up. Like I'm not running into it this time thinking that I'm all fixed and I'm all healed and that I should be this person that I thought I should be. I'm not putting those unrealistic expectations on myself that I maybe subconsciously did last time. No, I'll definitely have times in my life where I struggle. There's no way you can eliminate all the tough times and whatnot. They're just going to happen whether you like it or not. This time I'm making sure that I know it sounds cliche, but set myself up for success. Yeah, I want to learn from those past experiences where I got to those dark points and go, okay, what needs to be different this time so that I can prevent that from happening again. I felt a lot of guilt not being able to even think about design or anything like that after I did my fundraising event and runway show. I felt like I was letting everybody down, and I had this sense of guilt and shame that I hadn't been able to do what I wanted to do and be the person that I wanted to be. I think I learned a lot from those experiences. And you know what? Sometimes a detour is actually the doorway to the path you were supposed to be on in the first place. Doesn't mean all that this other path that you've walked is all for nothing. You take the experiences from this path and you take them into this new journey that you're going to walk. I've always wanted to use fashion in a way that creates meaning. It can be very superficial, like it seems skin deep at times, and I've always wanted to have that underlying purpose to it. I don't exactly know what it's going to look like yet. I want to use the creativity that I have in a way that's going to empower women, bring women together, and to better the world. I wish I had all the answers, and I wish I had this big happy ending. But dreams are always a work in progress, and they can change over time. I don't think my desire to do something with purpose and meaning has changed at all. But I think the way that I wrap my creativity around those values may change and evolve over time. So I'm excited to kind of just see how it unfolds. I am very grateful for Janine and Lewis sticking by me all these years, and for them just loving me when I least deserved to be loved. And I'm very thankful for them just believing in me. No, I don't hold anger towards my abusers. I would like them to be held accountable, mostly because I don't want it happening to other people. Yeah, most of the time I don't think a lot of what ifs, but sometimes I do get moments of sadness because I can see that some of my present day struggles are because of maybe what happened or maybe what didn't happen growing up. And I can see areas that I need to work harder in than other people to get the same results. And sometimes that doesn't seem fair at all, and it's not. Do I live my life wishing it was different? No, I don't spend my life thinking about that. But yeah, there's definitely moments of sadness or frustration where I'm like, oh, like this is not fair that I have to spend so much extra on like my assignment or studying when it takes someone else so much less time because they've had a whole lifetime of doing assignments and whatnot. Like, yeah, it is. I've had to recognise that because of trauma and because of some of the things that I didn't experience growing up, like the lack of social contact and traditional schooling. There are consequences that I do have to live with. Although I would not wish the things that I've gone through on anybody, I know that my experiences, both good and bad, have made me who I am today. And in a way, I am grateful, not for the pain and the experiences themselves so much, but from what I learned from them and how I've grown through them. I think some of my hopes for the future would be using what I've been through and using my story to encourage others who might have struggled in a similar situation. I would hope that my story can be that little bit of hope that things can be different for them and that change is possible. My hope is also that my story would encourage those who are walking alongside someone who's struggling, be it parents or friends, or everybody knows someone who's in their life who's struggling. And it can be such a helpless feeling because you don't know what to do, and it may seem like it's never going to end, but I would hope that my story can give you some kind of hope as well, that things can be different. One of my hopes for the future is that I can use my creativity and the skills that I've been given and the skills that I've learnt and just all the things that other people have invested into my life, that I can then use them in a way that I can then invest in other people as well. I just hope at the end of my life I can look back and go, yes, my life has mattered. Like, I've used my life in a way that's left an impact on the world.